Hey there everyone, it's Nina. Thanks for joining me today for another video. I'm really excited to share today's video with you because I'm playing with a technique that I haven't quite seen before out there, and maybe I've missed it, but I thought this would be so much fun. I have played around with embossing folders and heat embossing, and usually what I have done in the past is put embossing ink on the folder, run it through my die cut machine with the paper to create a really cool debossed finish on my embossed paper, and then I'll put embossing powder on it, heat set it, and that creates a really cool resist. I've done that many times in the past and I love that technique, but I thought it would be fun to put a spin on it and do the embossing on the raised surface of the embossed design. So that's what I'm going to be doing today, and that is what you're seeing on this card. Those little sections of gold embossing powder that shine in the light so beautifully, those were created by putting embossing ink down, and we put embossing powder on top of that and then use that as a resist as we add ink over top. A fun technique. This is really cool, and I was so excited to share it with you all. So I hope you're ready to get inky because this is going to be a lot of fun. Now, before I get started, in today's video, I am using brand new products from Simon Says Stamp's Festive Fun release. So this is a brand new collection of products from Simon that just came out, perfect for the holidays. And as you can see, this project that I'm making today is a Christmas card, and it uses multiple items from the release to create it. But I also do want to specify that you don't have to use the new products from this release to do this technique. All you need is an embossing folder, embossing ink, and gold embossing powder. That's it. And then you can create the exact same look that I'm getting. It'll just be a different design. All right, so why don't we jump on in? I'm using the Snow Poppies embossing folder from Simon Says Stamp. It is my absolute favorite embossing folder from this release. When I saw this, I truly gasped because it's so lovely. I'm going to emboss some Canson Bristol paper because this paper takes ink and water really well, and I embossed that with my die cut machine. After pulling out the paper from my embossing folder, I am taking my embossing ink pad and dragging it across the paper very carefully. I'm not pressing this down. I don't want to oversaturate the paper with embossing ink because I don't want to cover everything. I just want it to look like it's been dusted with some embossing. So very carefully I applied that embossing ink to the paper. You can't see it right now, but as I bring in the gold embossing powder, you're going to start to see where that ink has been applied. So I'm going to carefully sprinkle on my embossing powder and try not to touch any of the areas of my paper. But this gold embossing powder is now going to get picked up by that ink, and I just love how the raised surfaces of this paper have caught all of that embossing ink and now hence the embossing powder. I'm going to take my heat tool and set this so that we get that beautiful gilded finish on the edges of our florals and our snowflakes. It's just magical. And because I did embossing, I can now add ink over top and it will resist any of the ink that I put down with it. So for my background, I'm going to actually do a mix of both oxides and distress inks. I love being able to mix these two inks together because they both perform a little differently. Oxides are, of course, opaque. They are more of a pigment-based ink, and so they are very saturated and beautiful for creating really intense, rich color. I applied those first. Then I'm going to bring in distress inks, and I'm going to layer those on top of the oxides. And the reason I did that is because oxides are opaque and distress inks are semi-transparent. So I'm going to get some of that oxide to still show through. I'm not going to be covering it up when I add distress ink. Because I'm working on Canson Bristol paper, I can add water flecks to the paper and lift it off to create that really nice water splatter effect, which looks so good. I'm not done inking yet, but I did want to add some layers underneath the ink. So I'm bringing in now a little distress mica stain. This is, I think, Yuletide. I have all the ink colors that I'm using and all the products that I've used today in this video linked below in the video description. But I splattered that paper with the mica spray just to get a little bit of a shimmer in those splatters. And then with a distressing tool from Holtz, I'm going to run this across the edges of my paper to get that really nice worn vintage feel. I'm actually being really rough with this because I want it to actually look vintage and worn. I'm actually going to tear some of the edges of the paper to create more of that vintage rustic finish, and I really like how that worked. This little distressing tool is really nice because the blades are protected inside of that tool, so you don't have any chance of cutting yourself, unlike if you tried to do this with scissors. All right, so here's where we're at with the background, but I'm not done adding ink. So I'm coming back in now with my Distress inks, not the oxides, but the inks, and I'm going back over top of certain areas of my background. I want to really intensify some of the darker areas, and I want to maintain that really nice light pink area that we have going on, kind of trailing through the middle section of the card. So I used not only red ink, but I also brought in brown. And I know brown sounds really weird and scary for something so rich and beautiful, but it really truly made a difference here. It added the perfect amount of contrast that I needed. It intensified that really nice dark red just how I wanted it. And it also added a little bit of warmth to the paper, which really goes nicely with the warm vintage feel. We've got the beautiful warm embossing. So all in all, it worked out really well. So now that I'm happy with the ink blending, now I'm bringing in some white paint. This is some Dina Wakley white spray paint, and I'm just flicking this with a paintbrush onto my background to create a snowy effect. I want this to look like there's some little tiny snowdrops flying through the air, and this white paint works really well on top of inks, including Distress inks. Now check this out as I tip this in the light. Look at how those beautiful flowers and snowflakes glisten with that gold embossing. This looks so amazing. I was so giddy with how this turned out because I was dreaming of adding something like this gilded effect to the embossing. So using the embossing ink and the gold embossing powder, it created exactly the look I was going for. So to accentuate my card and wrap things up, I'm pulling out this really cute bow from the old-fashioned Christmas stamp set from Simon's new release. And I'm going to stamp this onto some green cardstock, and I am going to emboss it. So I'm going to prep the surface of the paper with my powder tool and stamp that bow onto some green cardstock. Now I actually will stamp this bow twice because I do want to create a layered effect for the bow. But I repeated the process for my stamping, embossing, and eventually ink blending. But before we get to that part, I did emboss the bow with a little bit of gold embossing powder, the same gold that I used for the background, so everything matches really nice. I used my heat tool to set it, and then I'm going to color the bow. I could color the bow with any medium, really, markers, colored pencils, but I thought inks would be fun. So I'm bringing in a Distress ink pad in Rustic Wilderness and a smaller blending brush, and I'm just going to add a little bit of shading to the inner parts of my bow, leaving the outer areas of the bow that light green cardstock color that we used to stamp and emboss. So this is just going to add some shading to the bow. It's quick and easy, but it's also really effective. I'm going to go ahead and die cut this bow with the coordinating dies. And again, I made 2 of these because I'm going to show you what I'm going to do here. I decided to place this bow in the top left corner of my card, but I also wanted it to feel dimensional. So I had made a second bow, and I'm going to actually cut the tails off of it because I just want the bow itself, not the tails, to be dimensional. I'm going to take my fine tip scissors from Simon Says Stamp and just trim off those little tails. Really simple to follow along the lines of the stamp to cut those off. And then I'm going to glue this onto my bow. So this way the bow is fluffy and then the tails just kind of hang down. So if you look at this from the side, you're going to see that dimension, and it looks almost like a realistic bow, but it's not as bulky. So I glued those 2 pieces together with some craft tacky glue, but then to make sure I get that little bit of lift on the bow around the sides, I'm going to take a couple of pieces of foam squares and just tuck those underneath of the bow to allow it to have that dimension off of the center. So the center is glued flat together with the craft tacky glue, but then the sides of the bow have that dimension. So we get that little bit more dimensional feel to this bow. Makes it more realistic. Now with a sentiment from that same old-fashioned Christmas stamp set, I'm going to stamp that onto some dark green cardstock. Again, I'm using embossing powder and ink to stamp this. I'm going to stamp with embossing ink and then use, in this case, cream embossing powder for the sentiment. I didn't want to add gold because I felt like there was a lot of gold going on here and I needed some contrast. So the cream embossing powder is going to give it a brighter appearance, but it's not quite as intense as white. I didn't want white because I didn't want it to like scream off of my card, but I did want it to have some difference from the gold. There are coordinating dies for the sentiment as well in that old-fashioned Christmas stamp set. And then my bow is going to get glued down directly to the card with some of that craft tacky glue. Now for the sentiment, I decided to pop that up, so I did bring in a couple of foam squares, and I'm going to line this up down along the bottom of my card. I love how this card, the background of it, looks like a beautiful piece of wrapping paper with the gold details and then that rich, variegated background. I just love it. To finish things off, I did bring in a few of these clear sequins from Simon Says Stamp, and I put a little trail of them coming down from the bow along with the sentiment, just to kind of form a little bit of a magical trail there. I was so happy with how this card turned out. With the gold details and then that beautiful rich background with the red colors, it's so perfect for Christmas. Now you could swap out the colors for something else if you wanted something maybe more of a green background, blues and purples, you name it. You can totally change up the colors here. But the thing I want you to walk away with is the fact that you can take your embossing ink pad, drag it across your raised surface of your paper after running that paper through an embossing folder. Then you get that ink to pick up all of your embossing and you get this gorgeous gilded finish on the card. So magical, and I hope you're inspired to try this out for yourself. Remember, you can use this technique on any embossed design that you have. But if you are interested in seeing any of the new products from the Festive Fun release, I do have those listed down below in the video description, as well as on my blog. There are picture links to everything I used today, and also a direct link to the release itself, so you can see all of the new products that Simon has to offer in this collection. So I appreciate that you watched this video and stayed through to the very end. Thank you so much. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. If you aren't already a subscriber, I'd love to have you, so be sure to hit that button. And if you want to get notifications for my videos, don't forget to hit the bell, so that way you'll get notified every time I post a new video. Until next time, friends, I hope you have a wonderful day, and thanks for stopping by.